This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with host Ben Pratt.
Those whose TSH scores are normal but on that high side of it, they have a greater risk of mortality, they have a greater risk of chronic degenerative disease, and they have a lower quality of life. They've got a higher pattern of symptomology.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Fit to Succeed show. We're excited to welcome back to the podcast Dr. Alan Christianson. He was on back in episode 30 where we talked about all things stress and metabolism. But today we're going to adjust that and talk a little bit about thyroid and its impact on health. Now, Dr. Christianson is a certified naturopathic doctor and he's the founder of the Endocrine Association of Naturopathic Doctors. He's been running his Integrative Healthcare Center since 1996 and has become a renowned name in the field of natural hormonal health and wellness. He is the author of several different books, including the best-selling books, The Adrenal Reset Diet, The Metabolism Reset Diet, and now, as I just mentioned, his latest book, The Thyroid Reset Diet. So let's get straight to the show where we're going to talk about all things health, fitness, weight loss and weight gain, metabolism, and thyroid function. It's great to be with you again, Dr. Alan Christianson. It's great to speak to you all the way from Arizona.
Hey, Ben. Thanks for having me. Nice to be with you as well.
Yeah, it's now, for our listeners, they may not have met you before. We've actually had you on our podcast show before where we spoke a lot about stress and metabolism, whereas today we're going to kind of adjust our direction just a little bit and talk a little bit more about thyroid health and how that impacts individuals in various ways. Why should the fitness professionals or the fitness enthusiasts that join us here on the Fit to Succeed show, why should they listen to this podcast today? And how could the thyroid and your book, The Thyroid Reset Diet, be relevant to them?
Yeah, good question. So a large number of their clients who are struggling with their health will be held back due to thyroid disease. And there are some pretty exciting solutions. We'll talk about a clinical trial. Somewhere around 70 to 80% of people may be able to reverse thyroid disease with diet only. So we'll discuss that's an option they may not be aware of. And the other big consideration is that there's a lot of common pitfalls. So many popular health habits, even a lot of common cosmetics, have ingredients that we now know can greatly worsen thyroid function. So it'll be a great way in which they can do a better job serving their clients.
All right. I think that's really interesting, and we're definitely going to get to those points. But I'm fascinated by that concept that thyroid problems, particularly hypothyroid, which is where we're going to focus a lot of our discussion today, that it can be reversed by diet. Yet this is a problem that I suppose mainstream medicine has continued to struggle with for a very long time now. I'm fascinated by that, and we're definitely going to get into that in just a little bit. But perhaps we should step back and perhaps just set the scene a little bit for the listeners. And what is, first of all, the prevalence of thyroid problems? How likely is a fitness professional going to come across someone who is experiencing this?
Yeah, we think about the prevalence of overt disease, and in the States, we see that to be somewhere around 5 to 10% based on the type of disease. And that's taking into account all adults. If we can think more specifically and think about women as they're aging, menopausal years and later, overt disease can affect a quarter of them. It can be 25% of this subpopulation. So the other thought is, all things in biology are on a continuum. It's not like a light switch, you will know that. And so there's overt disease, but one scintilla short of overt disease is not radical health. So there's this window in which people can be for perhaps a decade in which they are not at overt disease, but they are not at optimal thyroid function. And we don't have hard data on that, but arguably that encompasses at least as many more as those who have overt disease. I've seen stats in Europe being a bit lower for rates of overt disease. But if we throw in that continuum and we think about demographics, women, menopausal, at least a quarter or more can be affected by this. And this is something that's on the rise as well. We see this in terms of rates of thyroid cancer, roughly tripled in the last few decades. And I've seen data in terms of prevalence for prescription of thyroid treatment as a proxy measure for prevalence of thyroid disease in Europe, also tripling over the last several decades since about the 80s. So it's radically on the rise.
That's
And
really
not
interesting.
rare. I guess one last thing is that autoimmune disease is more recognized and more prevalent. And by far, thyroid disease is the most common of all autoimmune diseases.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that thyroid is one of the very commonly occurring autoimmune disorders. And I believe Hashimoto's thyroiditis is the one that relates to that. Is that correct?
It sure is. So thyroid disease, we think about three broad categories. There's diseases of how the gland secretes hormones. The gland is a little thing that makes hormones that control how well we store or burn energy, how well we conduct nerve signals, and how well we repair our bodily structural proteins. Those are the big three things that it controls. And it can make the right amount of hormone that we need or too much or too little. So we call that hyperthyroid at the excess and hypothyroid at a lack. So that's a disease of function. Then we have diseases of structure. The gland can grow inappropriately. In a good system, the gland has cells that normally do die and wear off and new cells that replace that, and a balance is struck throughout adulthood. But in some cases, that growth can be exaggerated. We can have goitres, nodules, thyroid cancers. Those are the main growth abnormalities. And then the last category would be inflammatory diseases. So the immune system can attack the thyroid because of particular features of it. And yeah, you mentioned Hashimoto's thyroiditis. That's by far the most common cause of the gland being underactive. We can also attack receptors outside the thyroid, and that's the most common thing that leads to it being overactive. That's Graves' disease. Then we have other things like subacute thyroiditis, which commonly comes on after viral illnesses. And we're seeing more of that in the pandemic era.
Indeed. Now, a few thoughts come to my mind as you were just explaining those categories of disease. And for me, one of those is, do you know, is there any reason or rationale as to why female gender, as you've mentioned a couple of times there, seems to, particularly postmenopausal and perhaps more so, is there any reasons why they seem to experience more of thyroid problems compared to males, for example?
Yeah. So female gender, so there's the gender and there's the age. And there's four big theories about the gender. Age is just, if something can go wrong, it's more apt to go wrong eventually if you give it more time to go wrong. So that's like the wear and tear hypothesis. The more miles on your car, the more things will need service. So yeah, that's the age part. But then there are these demarcations in a woman's hormonal life. Onset of menstrual cycles, pregnancy, the cessation of menstrual cycles, the transition before that. And there's a lot of interplays between estrogen and thyroid hormones. One of the most salient examples of that is a compound called thyroid binding globulin. And that's a protein that neutralizes about a third of circulating thyroid hormones. And it's tightly linked to estrogen status. So when there's a large change in estrogen status, into or out of pregnancy, menopause, there's a shuffling of the deck, so to speak, in how well we regulate thyroid hormones. And if there are any latent issues making the thyroid harder to control, that's when it gets pushed over the edge. So that's why those big stations in life can precipitate disease. And then gender in general, the top theory is that there's not a gender difference in iodine requirements, but there seems to be a gender difference in iodine tolerance, tolerance of excess iodine. So that's one. Second theory is that a lot of the genetic variables that give rise to thyroid disease are X-linked. Generally, women have 2 X chromosomes, men have 1. So if there are any X-linked issues, they've got just double the odds of them manifesting. Then we know about fetal microchimerism. So the cells that form during pregnancy, some of them can cross the placenta and end up in the body and be treated as foreign. And that's we think, one of the reasons why just autoimmune disease in general has a gender bias. And the proportionality is somewhere between 6 to 10-fold more common amongst women than men for thyroid disease.
No, that's quite a bit more, isn't it? 6 to 10-fold more. So it's highly likely.
It's a lot more. As common as thyroid disease is, I think it's important to bear in mind that guys get it. There's a lot of guys that have it, but in a population, there will be many more women that have it than men.
No, I'm with you. So nobody's completely guaranteed immunity from it. It is a condition that can affect either gender, but just more prevalence in females, particularly of an older age. Now, the next natural step for me comes to ask, well, if it's more prevalent in the female population, although guys get it too, what are the obvious signs or symptoms? Now, I'm talking about without a lab test, because I appreciate you could go to your doctor can do thyroid hormone testing and be able to diagnose it. But prior to that, what might give somebody an indication that they might be experiencing particularly hypothyroid function?
Yeah, this is an awesome question. And, you know, I see a lot of popular discussions on thyroid health want to have the most comprehensive list of symptoms. And the tough thing is that, hormones are distinct chemical messengers that we make in one part of the body that influence other parts of the body. And they do so by receptors. So we have some cells that have receptors for some hormones. Estrogen has receptors in the uterus and the breast, for example, but not everywhere. The one hormone that's represented by receptors in every cell of the body is thyroid hormone. So it literally affects everything head to toe. So pretty much any possible symptom can be on that list. And that's a whole lot of noise relative to signal, not a lot of clarity from that. There's classic symptoms people often ascribe and they think about in terms of easy weight gain / difficult weight loss, unexplained fatigue, poor exercise recovery, thinning, diffuse even thinning of head hair, drier skin, menstrual irregularities. Those are some of the more salient ones. A curious thing about some of the natures of thyroid symptoms, one is that there's not a very high specificity, meaning that there's no symptoms that have to be there. Many people have thyroid disease and they have a distinct set of symptoms from others with thyroid disease. So I'll hear some say, yeah, I've had this hair thinning, but my weight's been fine, so it must be something other than my thyroid. Well, not necessarily. There's about a dozen symptoms that are the most statistically probable. And I almost imagine like someone deals some cards and people who get thyroid disease, they get a couple cards and the median number of symptoms is 3. So most
Right.
have a couple symptoms. There's distinct combinations from one to another. One piece of data that helps distinguish thyroid symptoms from just random ways in which we all have our own little long-term glitches is that there's often some time frame in which they've emerged. So not, like lifelong, for example, I've struggled to maintain my weight and I wouldn't immediately think of that as a thyroid symptom. However, if I said that I've had better or worse, been able to balance my weight up until last November and then things all fell apart,
Right.
that's different. So anything you can ascribe a time frame in which it's emerged or changed, that's more suspicious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, really intuitive, that time frame piece you've just said there, because as you were going through some of those list of symptoms, I couldn't help but think, well, that kind of sounds like a middle-aged guy, he's putting on a bit of weight, thinning his hair, how would that guy know if he actually had thyroid problems?
Well, and at any given point in time, 20% of us are going to feel crappy in various random ways, and that comes and goes, and we've all got our better or worse days. And that's tricky, so it's not that, but if things really are different in a way that's distinct over a time frame, progressive, persistent, then we think more about its relevance.
Now, in the very beginning of your book, The Thyroid Reset Diet, you've got a short quiz, which I guess is to allow people to just assess, their current circumstances to whether there's a likelihood that they have thyroid. Could you comment on that and how that differs to just being a symptomology list?
For sure. So that was inspired by the Colorado Thyroid Prevalence Survey. This was done back in '98. They tracked about 25,000 people and they gave them quizzes with longer sets of questions and then also thyroid blood tests. And after the fact, they did this statistical analysis to see which symptoms were just quite simply most predictive of thyroid disease. So they were from that. And these are ones that there's a very high correlation, but again, not a rule out. So you don't have to have all the symptoms, but the more of them that are there, the more probable it becomes.
Right. So it's a likelihood rating really. So if you score highly on that, it's more likely that you could. So does that then, the next step would be if I scored highly on that quiz that I probably should go and then get a proper test to diagnose?
You're absolutely right. So this is something to where blood tests are really definitive. And this brings back our earlier discussion about overt disease from developing disease. So there's just definitional guidelines on what we call hypothyroidism. And blood tests look at how the brain is talking to the thyroid, what the thyroid is releasing into the bloodstream, and then how the immune system is treating the thyroid. Those are the main things. So the brain part is worth mentioning because it's backward. The lazier your thyroid is, the more your brain yells at your thyroid. Right. So we call this the thyroid stimulating hormone. And the more underactive your gland is, the higher that number goes because it's getting yelled at. And then the opposite, if there's too much thyroid hormone on board, that number goes low because your brain is not asking for more. Everything else is just more direct and linear. So We define hypothyroidism by a TSH above a normal threshold and then a low output of one of the two main hormones called T4, and then plus the presence of some symptoms that I've described. So straightforward, no debates. However, there are many to where they can be in that decade preceding overt disease in which their scores could be normal. They may not be in what's called a optimal range, but they're still within normal, and they may be developing symptoms. So that can be a bit of a conundrum for some.
So I mean that's interesting, because that sounds a little bit to me like the clinical diagnosis of pre-diabetes. You haven't reached the numbers yet, but we're calling you pre-diabetic. Is there a term for someone who's pre-hypothyroid?
It's just been called that. Early Hashimoto's has been one phrase, but that's a great analogy. So yeah, we call in endocrinology, we call diabetes a recurrent morning fasting glucose greater than 127. But yeah, 124 is nothing to celebrate.
Exactly, yeah.
So to translate those numbers, the TSH, again, backward marker, normal range is up to 4.5. And above that, plus the other two criteria, we label that hypothyroidism. Now, there's been a lot of studies saying that people who have no apparent thyroid symptoms, they have no signs of thyroid autoimmunity, they have no strong family history of thyroid disease, within the normal range, they never have TSH scores greater than 2, almost never. It's quite unusual. So there are many who are normal, but are in that higher side of it that are suspicious for having early disease.
Yeah, that's interesting. Why then is the clinical diagnosis as high? Is it 4.5? Is it before where you would say someone has a thyroid problem?
Yeah.
Seems unusual that they would make it so high when yet you're saying that it's very rare for someone to be above even 2 in their TSH score.
It is. When I started practicing in the 90s, the upper normal range was 12. So it was much worse. But yeah,
changed a lot over the years then.
So we've seen data showing that healthy people don't have high TSH scores. We've also seen that those who have thyroid disease, those whose TSH scores are normal but on that high side of it, they have a greater risk of mortality. They have a greater risk of chronic degenerative disease, and they have a lower quality of life. They've got a higher pattern of symptomology. So there's like 3 separate lines of data suggesting that this low, narrower range is probably more reflective of optimal function.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think we need to be looking at optimal function and not just what's the diagnosis for disease, for sure. Now, you mentioned symptomology there, and that led my thoughts to another question, which is, if we bring this back to sort of real world individuals, particularly our listening audience, those who are into fitness, if somebody was already, well established in their fitness regime, but then things with their thyroid started to go wrong, how could a low thyroid affect, their fitness experience?
Yeah, so we're talking to fitness enthusiasts, basal metabolic rate, not going to be a foreign concept to people. So the biggest normal variable of our basal metabolic rate is our body composition, just how much lean body mass we're carrying. And yet thyroid function can change that dramatically. So in terms of numbers, one can see the basal metabolic rate suppressed by 60% with hypothyroidism. So yeah, and you professionals are aware of people who they're struggling, they're seemingly doing everything right, but not making progress. And when you really talk to people and work with them, a large number, when you probe, aren't really doing everything right. On the first pass, they say they are, but when you really get into it, yeah, okay, well, I guess there's this, there's that.
Absolutely, that happens.
What's that?
That happens for sure.
But there are those to where on the third and the fourth pass, you realize, oh, wow, they're busting their butts. They're counting the food. They're doing everything they can. And it's just not working right for them. So that can be a real thing.
Now, I know obviously in the past we've discussed the stress issue, and quite often you find with people who are highly committed in the fitness space, it's sometimes that's the problem, that it's an excessive stress load that they've created because of their anxieties around fitness and health and diet.
Sure.
Does thyroid play a role in any of that? I mean, I believe that the thyroid and the adrenal glands sort of interact. How could thyroid be impacted by somebody who's perhaps doing a little bit too much of all of those things to keep themselves lean and in shape?
Yeah, so a quick distinction for starters is that the stress response can change fuel partitioning. We can send more fuel to visceral fat and less to lean body mass in a heightened state of chronic stress, but we're still following thermodynamics and expected basal metabolic rate per body size. Thyroid function doesn't change the partitioning as much, but it just radically changes the thermodynamics. It can radically change the basal metabolic rate. And stressors, it's a funny thing. It can be difficult to tease apart the effects of stress on precipitating an illness. we try to quantify the severity of stress in various ways. And at any point, most of us could point to various things that are annoying us. But yeah, there are more catastrophic events that can leave their wake. We know that Graves' disease is highly apt to come on after someone has large major life stressors like the move or the divorce or whatnot. Hashimoto's, the data is mixed on that. What we do see is that there's a relationship between how well the body can respond to thyroid hormones and how good the cortisol balance is. So in a healthy state of low stress and high resilience, there's a morning cortisol awakening response and a nighttime suppression of cortisol. We call that the cortisol slope. And when the stress levels are not well managed, that slope may be always high, always low, or backward. And any of those slope abnormalities can make the cells not uptake thyroid hormones as well. So sometimes that can compound thyroid disease. And yeah, we're not sure how well it precipitates Hashimoto's, but it certainly can compound the symptomology.
Right. So excessive stress could aggravate someone who already has issues with their thyroid. That's what we're saying.
Never a helpful thing.
No, it's not, for sure. Now, I wonder as well there is that if somebody knows that they've got thyroid problems, they've already been diagnosed, are there any particular types of exercise or exercise recommendations you would give that actually can be beneficial for somebody who'd like to try and stay in shape but not cause more trouble to their thyroid?
Yeah, very specifically, the recommendation is to exercise, and not to be frightened of that. I actually spoke to a woman yesterday, and she'd had thyroid disease for some time, and someone very well-meaning but misinformed discouraged her from any aggressive, challenging physical activity for fears of, vague fears of raising inflammation or causing problems. And we've got a lot of evidence that just doing regular exercise and being consistent with it and progressing it in a responsible way can improve symptomology more than most anything else to large effect sizes. So yeah, so please, if you've got thyroid disease, do not think that you are fragile. And there's a quote Jonathan Haidt has made as an author about one of the most negative ideas that's emerged in the recent past. And there's this idea that what does not kill us makes us weaker, that we're just inherently fragile. And yeah, if you've got thyroid disease, no one would be served to launch into an extreme regime they're not used to. But when you're working with a professional guide and you're progressing in an appropriate, responsible way, there are a few things that can help your health more than exercise.
That's good to hear. We're definitely behind you on that one. That it's great to hear that exercise is beneficial in this particular battle. Fantastic. Now, occasionally, we'll find in the fitness industry when you're working with clients or individuals that sometimes there's this pervasive thought process, or maybe even there's a bit of family history there where someone goes, well, my parents had slow thyroid, so I must have a slow thyroid. That's the reason I've gained weight. But when we actually look at the figures in Europe, 20 to 30% of people have obesity, but we're only looking at about 5, maybe up to 8% prevalence of thyroid. So clearly it's not the only reason, but what connection is there in reality between low thyroid and obesity?
Yeah, it's a great point. So by no means is that relevant to all that have weight struggles. But the funny thing is, it is bidirectional as well. So slow thyroid function can, like I said, greatly impair metabolic rate. However, we also see that the inflammatory effects of obesity can be one of the factors that precipitates abnormal thyroid function. So there can be a precipitating effect that way. This is bizarre, but something I've reached that I think is a pretty solid conclusion, but striking, is that we've got trauma, we've got infectious disease, so you put that over here. Everything else that goes wrong, all of our non-communicable diseases, they almost all stem greatly from this inflammatory load, and this biggest inflammatory origin really are adipokines, these cytokines that are adipose tissue derived. So yeah, a few extra pounds in the wrong place can be amongst the biggest factors for precipitating negative health outcomes, and thyroid disease included. So yes, for sure, many who struggle with their weight has nothing to do with their thyroid. For those to whom it does, they likely will not achieve success until they improve their thyroid function. The degree of negative energy intake they would have to sustain to lose weight is just unreasonable when their metabolism is suppressed. Now, on the other hand, what I see is that when someone can reverse and improve, so let's say someone did gain weight, it totally was the fault of their thyroid. So then what's their path when they correct that? Somewhere around 20% of those who then restore their thyroid function by correcting it, like means that we'll talk about, or thyroid medication, their weight bounces back. They do nothing else special. They bounce back to their pre-thyroid weight.
Right.
So that's the minority of people. It's probably 20%. However, the remaining 80% can at least reach a state in which they will respond to their diet and training as they should have beforehand.
Right, I'm with you. So from that, I'm gleaning that you're suggesting that if someone has thyroid problems and has a weight problem, that they would need to start with trying to resolve the thyroid issues, which then would give them a better metabolic rate to get out there and then deal with the obesity issue. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I encourage people to put efforts onto that, not to say that they shouldn't put efforts onto lifestyle change during that process, but just to not have the highest expectations that they're going to be losing weight at first until their thyroid is stabilized. At least do enough to try to forestall further gain and start getting some healthy habits in place, but know that your efforts will be greatly amplified when your thyroid function has resumed normalcy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's, I can imagine people being frustrated with their health and fitness when their thyroid function is low, but with a very low metabolism and constantly feeling tired and fatigued, I'd imagine it's a real battle to try and really engage with the fitness program.
Yeah.
Okay, now one last question on this particular vein on weight management, and that's because, as I'm sure you're well aware, there's lots of talk in the low carb community, and I know you've looked at that sort of content before, but in the low carb community, you often hear people talking about that if you are on a low carb diet for too long, and perhaps particularly with females, that low carb eating, whether that's for weight loss or some other reason, can potentially have a negative impact on thyroid. What's your thoughts with regards to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So it turns out that our thyroid is exquisitely tuned to our body's energy balance. And if we're in an overall state of negative energy balance to a great enough degree, one of the ways we intentionally suppress our metabolic rate is by lowering our thyroid output. So we don't run out of gas when we got a low gas tank. We lower how quickly we burn fuel. And it turns out that in many ways, insulin output can be a proxy for fuel status. So we could have adequate fuel from other macronutrient sources, but if insulin levels are too low, it's almost like it games the system. Our body still thinks we're starving, and we can still have an impairment of thyroid output. One of the more extreme demonstrations of this comes from studies on children on ketogenic diets. So kids, we talked about some rates of thyroid disease for adults. The numbers are pretty much 100-fold lower amongst children. Most pediatric groups, it's a case per 1,000 or a case per several thousand of kids developing thyroid disease. It doesn't happen much, but they've tracked pretty thoroughly children who are given ketogenic diets for purposes of managing their seizures. And one of the known complications is that per study, somewhere around 27% of them develop overt thyroid disease that requires management. And what happens is that insulin certainly is a good marker of fuel. And certainly there's plenty of circumstances when it's elevated as a sign of there's being fuel excess and a lot of negative things that correlate with that. However, if it's too low, that impairs our body's activation of thyroid hormones and also our secretion of them. And in some cases, that can precipitate thyroid disease that is quite latent. That's an extreme example. There's been other data arguing that not full-on ketogenic, but lower carb overall can have proportionate similar effects. So yeah, so I do encourage I always encourage having a decent amount of protein for maintaining healthy connective tissue, but past that point, not being, demonic or obsessive about either macro and having some of each and keeping them in their place, but not really avoiding either the fat or the carbs.
And, I would tend to ascribe to that thought process as well, is get the protein right, and then you can balance out the carbs and fats with the remaining calories. Though,
you've got options on that, but don't do none of either.
Yes, that wouldn't be helpful, would it? It has drawn my thoughts though, because obviously you've written a book on stress, you've written a book on metabolism reset, and now you've written the thyroid reset. Have your macronutrient guidelines or any thoughts on that changed from thought process to thought process, from stress to metabolism and to thyroid, or do you pretty much find that a similar sort of dietary approach benefits all three?
Well, and all three of these have a reset phase and a maintenance phase. So the stress response, that engaged the mechanism of cortisol as a glucocorticoid, as a glucose regulating hormone. And so for that one, pretty much all those I've talked about the same targets for protein requirements. My best read on that is like a quarter or a third of one's caloric intake, a little bit different during that metabolism reset. I'll come back to that. But that's kind of a basal amount. And so with the stress response, the game was to how do we help restore that cortisol slope?
Yeah.
And with cortisol being a glucocorticoid, I did a pattern which, it takes years to write a book, right? So I talked about this idea of carb cycling as I wrote this manuscript. And as the book was coming out, a lot of folks started talking about carb cycling in a whole different way, like 2 days on, 2 days off. I'm like, no, my idea was changing it throughout the daily cycle to help restore that cortisol slope. So that was the idea with the adrenal reset during that reset phase.
So was that, if I remember right, it was a while ago I read that book, was that more carbs in the morning and less at night? Was that what you were doing?
Exactly, for that purpose. Metabolism reset, maintenance phase is general healthy ideas. The reset phase was the protein being especially essential, not because when you're on a lower fuel regime, then it's harder to talk about protein as a percent of calories because your total calories might be quite low. And you could be below a threshold to maintain lean body mass at a negative fuel state and lose a lot of lean body mass. So in that case, I didn't so much target a percent of protein, but more so a grams per pounds of lean body mass.
I'm with you.
And then relied on both for the remainder. And for the thyroid reset, I think it was more broad strokes because there's not a lot of hard granular data, but there is some arguing about the detriments of too severe low carb and some similar benefits of adequate protein relative to thyroid health.
And in thyroid, just to wrap this little bit up, in thyroid, is there problems with excessive fat intake? So if someone did go ketogenic, they're low carb, but then the fat is high, does that high fat intake potentially have an impact, or is there not data for
there's some data on that? Honestly, our volume of evidence for the relevance of iodine to thyroid function is about 30,000 human clinical studies. Everything else that's not that, the volume of data is within about a dozen human clinical studies.
So small numbers.
There was one study looking at food categories and how food categories predicted the onset of autoimmune thyroid disease. And that one did suggest that diets highest in highly processed meats, high calorie, low nutrient animal fats were more predictive of the onset of thyroid disease, whereas a greater intake of lean proteins and then also a fair amount of diverse categories of vegetable types and plant food types were predicted with less onset of disease. So yeah, there's that. But when we'll start talking about iodine, but one recent researcher said that iodine is not the only thing relevant to thyroid health, but it's more relevant than all the other things combined.
Great. Well, and on that very poignant statement, let's ask a bit more about that, because historically, iodine was always known as being, I suppose, the anti-goitre nutrient, that we'd see pictures. Certainly I did it growing up of people in sort of third world countries who had a lack of iodine and they had goitres in their neck. But your book sort of is pointing out that that's not a problem anymore. The issue is excess iodine. Would you mind explaining the connection then between iodine intake and thyroid function?
For sure. So it's pretty weird. So nutrients, all the things that we think about nutrients in general, we've got to put those aside because a lot of the biases just don't fit with iodine. So we think about nutrients being used in a lot of parts of the body and a lot of chemical reactions. We think about having a broad, safe range of intake. We think about the amounts, if our intake is adequate, the amounts of our blood suffices for our body's tissues. None of that stuff applies to iodine. All that just out the window. It's one thing required in one place, and the amount in the blood is not appropriate. So what happens with there's iodide and iodine. And iodide is more inert and less reactive and easier to handle. The thyroid requires iodine for its chemical reactions.
Right.
So we can safely have iodide in our blood. We concentrate that into iodine within the thyroid. We cannot safely have iodine outside the thyroid. People die from iodine overdose when that happens. Right. So we handle it almost like the big thick gloves and the long tongs and that smoking cauldron. That's how the body is treating this stuff. It's just a little bit, just in this right place, very delicate balance. And then the window is crazy narrow. We could prevent scurvy on like a dozen milligrams of vitamin C. I mean, no joke. An adult could not get scurvy on that little. And then we could safely take 100, maybe arguably 1,000-fold that without major ill adverse effects. So we've got a broad range for a lot of nutrients. The World Health Organization, after looking at literally hundreds of nations that's changed their iodine status, has shown that the safest range for adults is between about 50 and 200 micrograms. It's tiny. Really narrow. And the paradox is that pediatric disease is known to come on at low thresholds. So in places to where we always talk about how good it is to have locally grown food, by and large it is, But back in the day, when your soil quality was low and all you had was local grown food, that wasn't always good. So if all you had was locally grown food, you had poor soil quality, there was no iodine fortification, then you could be below a threshold of 20 or so micrograms per day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many adults can do okay with that, but a lot of kids develop goitre and some develop congenital hypothyroidism. And in the most severe examples of that, there's cretinism, which looks like almost like a different species, almost like a Neanderthal appearance.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the severe deficiencies. In the UK and in the US, this was relevant up until about the 20s and the 30s.
Right.
And that's when fortification came on. In the US, that was fortification in the salt and in dairy manufacturing. In the UK, the fortification was just in dairy. They added iodine to cattle feed.
Right.
But in both cases, like in the US, for example, coming up on World War I, they would examine young men, see if they could go off to war. And in some places, a third of them could not because they had goitres.
All right.
And they said, hey, we've got to do something about this. So they fortified the salt in some regions. And in the following decade, the rate of goitre plummeted. It went from like 30% to 2 to 3% in some areas. It was a win.
Mm-hmm.
But there were vitriolic dialogues taking place in the medical community because they saw the unmasking of thyroid disease. So the rate of autoimmune thyroid disease in the decades following fortification, they increased 26-fold for some groups. So yeah, 26-fold increase.
So the historical record really backs up this sort of concept that it's this narrow range. Too low is a problem, but too much also a problem. And it sounds like
some current context on
that wasn't even considered in the fortification process.
You know, it really wasn't known. It was a problem that no one was aware could have predicted. But in current context, if we go back to 92, there was 112 nations that were categorized as severely iodine deficient.
Mm-hmm.
By 2014, all 112 were moved out of that category. So
Right.
now none are categorized as severely iodine deficient. We have 7 countries considered at a mild iodine deficiency. And that's where there can be more pediatric goitre, but there's actually lower rates of adult disease. However, the change from 92 to 2014, there were 0 nations considered at risk for iodine excess at 92. By 2014, 52 nations are considered at risk for thyroid disease due to iodine excess. And that includes much of the Western world.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned a little minute ago about sort of anywhere from 50 to 200 micrograms being the sort of average sort of recommendation. I believe I looked at in the US, it seems to be about 150. And in the UK, it's also around 140, 150 micrograms per day for adults. That changes. It's usually higher for pregnancy. But something that I noticed while I was preparing for this interview with you was that when you use most food analysis software, it's rare to see that they actually provide food iodine levels.
It's not rare. It doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I was like, I could hardly find anywhere that actually identified, there's so many apps and programs available today for fitness enthusiasts to use, and they don't quantify iodine. So how do people go about managing their food intake? Can you give some examples of foods that are lower in iodine and those that may be excessively high that we should avoid? Yeah,
for sure. And you bring up a great point. So it's a capricious element and it varies tremendously from food to food, from sample to sample. Right. In a loaf of bread, it can vary from slice to slice from manufactured bread. I'm not even kidding. But you'll see almost no databases, even just lists of iodine in food that cover more than the same dozen food that every other short list has. It's right. I worked hard to get a list of over 600 foods and about 50 samples per food. I did a lot of averaging, a lot of minimum, maximum thresholds. And what I brought it down to was green light, yellow light, red light foods. So if you wish to improve thyroid function, eat green light. If you're stable, you can throw in 1 or 2 yellow lights and do fine. But what we see is that too much is a problem, but also radical deviations are a problem. So there are some foods that often don't have much, but occasionally have whopping amounts. And those are ones I would pull out as well.
Such as?
One big concept is that almost no foods have none. So if someone's consuming a diet with a big range of food categories, they're not going to be iodine deficient. We just don't see that in the modern world. If someone's diet is subsistence, they're in one of these historical areas, yeah, that happened. That just doesn't happen anymore. So that's really not a concern. As far as tracking, you're right. There's no smart ways to really measure, analyze, quantify. We can talk about the testing for iodine. That's also pretty messy. But the smartest thing is really just being aware of these big outliers and making them not regular. So sea vegetables are probably things, they're not as commonly consumed, but when they are, they're the largest contributors for total amounts.
Yeah,
As
that really
far as
surprised me. I mean, the amounts in sea vegetables, I mean, they're huge. You stated like in your book over 80,000 micrograms in some sea vegetables. I mean, that seems insane.
Yeah, you know, and the consensus that researchers say is that there's there's not a lot of difference in iodine requirements from person to person, apart from just body size, but there's a lot of difference in iodine tolerance.
Mm.
So how well can people tolerate those occasional excesses? And the majority of people can tolerate the occasional excesses and do fine. They are not the ones who develop thyroid disease. But
So I
those who
have
are
to ask though, I mean, there's obviously some cultures that will, live by the ocean and consume sea vegetables more than others. Where I live, it's not something that people consume particularly often, but there's definitely cultures, perhaps East Asia, places like that, that will consume them quite a lot. I mean, do we see higher issues there with thyroid?
We do. It's not a coincidence that Dr. Hashimoto was the first to quantify the mechanism of action of thyroid disease. They have the highest rates of autoimmune, thyroid cancer, inflammatory thyroiditis in Japan. They have the highest national overall intakes of iodine. And even at that, there certainly are some within generation and epigenetic extended generation adaptations that can occur. People can get better at managing the excess. But even in those cases, they do see more thyroid disease from their exposure.
Yeah, I find it so interesting when you begin to look at sort of cross-cultural eating habits and, for example, the Japanese diet, so well known for having lower rates of heart disease, and people say we should eat that way because it'll reduce heart disease. But then on the other side of things, as you've just pointed out, they have higher rates of thyroid because of the way they eat. It never seems to be so straightforward and linear as just copy someone else's diet.
The thyroid issue is tied to almost nothing besides the iodine intake. So we could do everything else in their diet, but just not throw in all the seaweed and come out pretty good.
That would do the job. So eat an East Asian diet, but without the seaweed.
Well, and to that point, the relevance of traditional diets, what we've seen in these last several decades as thyroid disease has progressed is that iodine can be found in foods so that it naturally occurs. So sea vegetables, seafood, where it's fortified, like we talked about with salt, where it's a contaminant, like in the case of dairy, used as a teat sanitizer, or where it's an agent of processing, where it's used as a preservative or a colorant or a texturizer. And in those cases, its use has elevated. So now in the modern diet, the sources that have changed the most are the iodine in dairy products and also in processed grain foods. And it's not a grains are bad, gluten is poison. It's not even that. It's just that buying things in the store from a large manufacturing company, they can have amounts of iodine that are radically variable and oftentimes unsafe.
So it sounds like even more proof for avoiding an excessively processed food diet again.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's many things I've come to realize that there's enough not to love on those long paragraph labels, right? You need a magnifying glass and a chemistry dictionary. That's sure enough to put it back, but it's not all on the list. So in the case of iodine in bread, for example, some breads will list iodinated dough conditioners. And you would think those are the ones that are high in iodine, and the ones that don't list that are lower in iodine. But researchers have asked that question, and they've gone to the grocery stores and bought bread and then analyzed them for their iodine content. It's not even predictive. So there's stuff that goes on behind the scenes that's not reflective on the labels.
All right. So your labels are never a guarantee then, even for certain processed foods.
They're bad enough as they are, but there's more than is even there.
I know. How frustrating is that? All right. So one last question, because obviously you've talked quite a bit about diet and being able to identify the foods that should be adjusted or avoided. And, for the listeners, if you buy Dr. Christianson's book, he very clearly outlines the foods and labels them, as he said, in red, yellow, and green categories that are high and moderate and low in iodine. But there's one other category you bring out in your book, and you alluded to this just a little bit earlier, and that is that dietary sources are not the only place we get iodine, but perhaps our cosmetics and even supplements are potentially sources of iodine. Could you just expand on that as a final point?
For sure. So yeah, supplements really, they will have that on the label. They will say that they contain it. However, what they contain could be much greater than what they say on the label. In terms of our needs and requirements and what our just basal intake is on a normal varied diet, any amount in supplementation is apt to push someone above the ideal range. So it's just better to avoid in supplementation. what we've seen now, there's work going on with the FDA to possibly legislate on this, but iodine is very popular in consumer cosmetic products. It makes creams smooth and not separate. It makes them not go rancid. And the amounts that are there, once we break down the math on which ingredients contain iodine, how much they contain, how much you actually use of that compound, how much absorbs across the skin, once you go through all those gates, you can still take a shower and get 10 times a day's safe amount of iodine entering your bloodstream. So in general, synthetic type, and I don't think all cosmetics are relevant because many, the quantity that we use, the volume we use is small enough to not be relevant, or they don't really apply to the skin and stay on. There's things we wipe off. There's things like hairspray or mascara that are tiny quantities. But yeah, conditioners, body lotions, face creams, sunscreens, the volume is relevant. They stay on the skin. And so synthetic things, PVP is the main compound. There's a couple dozen names for that. I went through those in the book. Natural things, it's not like a synthetic versus natural. Natural things use the same compounds, but they call them kelp extracts or seaweed extracts.
Yeah.
So those are the big things to look out for on those products.
So what is PVP? I mean, what is the reason that they're using those products? What's it for?
Makes cream smooth, makes them not separate and get chunky. It does help their properties. It makes them also, it's a very good preservative. Iodine's a great antimicrobial. So it's a very useful chemical. It's a very low cost chemical.
No doubt you've probably used EWG's cosmetics database. I had a look on there for PVP and it listed foundations that women use on their makeup. It listed facial masks, moisturizers, conditioner for your hair, and even toothpaste as the most commonly sourced cosmetics with PVP in it.
And I try hard not to be alarmist. So actually I didn't go against toothpaste. I did the math on how many grams you would likely ingest of toothpaste. And if you're using as directed, you're probably not ingesting even half of a gram.
Right,
if you're
so
consuming half the tube, like with a spoon, that could be a bad idea. But
so another reason to be sure you spit it out, huh? But you kind of alluded there that those things that we use, like personal care products that are used that remain on the skin for longer, like foundation, for example, or a facial mask that might be on for 20 minutes, those are the ones to be more concerned about. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's exactly right. And I thought through about, I took a gram scale and went in the shower and grabbed some of my wife's products, and you can easily do a pump or two of conditioner and get 20 grams out of that. So in iodine, we're talking about micrograms. So we're starting with 20 million grams. And we chop down that maybe that product is only 0.5% PVP, and PVP is only 12% iodine. And we only absorb 4.5% of iodine, but still all those gates starting at 20 million, you can still end up with 2,000-3,000 micrograms. So yeah, it's relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. It is relevant. I find that particular section in the book very fascinating, and you did a great job explaining the numbers. So I do encourage people to pick up your book and to give it a read. I wish we had a bit more time, but it's been a fascinating discussion, and you've been really open with so much information, but there's still so much more to benefit from. Anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Boy, very quickly. So the main thing that excited me want to write the book was there's been several studies showing that this is not just the horse is out of the barn, now we know what color the horse is. This is, you can get better. So it turns out that if one can get to a low enough iodine threshold for a long enough period of time, thyroid disease can reverse about 2/3 of the time. So it varies per condition, per study, per duration of illness. But the majority of adults can have their disease. And by reverse, I'm not equivocating. I mean, they can have normal thyroid function without treatment. This is based upon human interventional controlled trials. So it's hard data, and it's a really exciting outcome.
And do your own clinical experiences and working with people with thyroid problems, does that back up that sort of figure of 2/3 of people can?
They do. The samples that my team and I work with are biased in that most have been on thyroid treatment for a decade or longer.
Right.
And in those groups, we'll see symptomatic improvement. We'll see lowering needs for medication. Some will no longer need medication. But in the minority of people we see who are earlier in the process and not on treatment for as long, we do see that 2/3 number bear out.
Well, it's been an enjoyable discussion, and once again, I'd like to express my thanks to you for your expertise, your willingness to give of your time freely, and I will link up to everything people need to know about you, your website, and of course your book. So thank you again, Dr. C. It's been a pleasure.
Nice to be with you, Ben. Thanks for the great questions.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.